It is the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There is creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hello, this episode is titled Israel and the Palestinian Intifadhas, Road or a Block to the Two-State Solutions by Sohel Bahjat. The Palestinian-Israeli relations, more than any other relations, have tremendous difficulties and ups and downs because of the fact that Israel came into existence through a hard and painful holocaustal birth, and the Palestinian people, on the other hand, discovered the modern ideas of citizenship and nationality after a long history of seclusion. In this episode, we will discuss and ascertain the reasons behind the complications that reflected the peace talks between the two sides that was almost knocking on the door of the final peace. The final result would be answering the question whether the two-state solution is possible, or is there no such a possibility after two Palestinian Intifadas or shake-offs. From the beginning of the establishment of Israel in 1948, the Jewish state had a perspective or a hope that its mere existence should be accepted among the Arabs who are neighboring the newly fragile small states. However, with the rise of Arab nationalists in Egypt in 1953, Syria in the 1960s, and Iraq in 1958, the situation was getting more complicated. The Arab leaders turned constitutional monarchies into republics that are still ruled in some cases by dictatorial regimes. Abdel Nasser dethroned King Farouk in a peaceful coup in 1953. Abdul Karim Qasim in Iraq, 1958, and in this case the coup was savage and brutal as the army butchered the Hashemite ruling family with cold blood. The Palestinians took a more of a harder line with Israel rather than trying to achieve a possible peaceful coexistence, probably to satisfy the Arab dictators. The rise of fascist pan-Arabism fed radical attitudes in dealing with Israel. This stiffness of the Arab national politics would be fractured in the early 1980s with the rise of radical Islam. Let us focus here on the point that as Israel got the opportunity to sit and negotiate peace arrangements with the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, after the Gulf War 1991, the secular Arab political parties and movements began having a great deal of competition from the Islamists, and the PLO was no exception. The first Intifada, 1987 to 1992, was led, at least in the media, by Arafat's secular movement Fatah or Fatah. But on the ground, Hamas, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, and the Palestinian Jihad were active in gathering protesters, stone throwers against the Israeli soldiers and settlers, and distributing media outlets against Israel occupation, in quotation marks. Hamas and Jihad, who represent some of the most radical Islamic movements who committed themselves to the destruction of Israel, are in fact a part of the bigger phenomenon of political Islam. The Shi'i volcanic eruption of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was a good news for Americans and the West for the reason that this theocratic regime, despite its hostility toward the West and Israel, was an enemy of the USSR or the Soviet Union by definition. The rise of Khomeini represented a stimulus for the Saudis to begin their own campaign of radicalization because of the sectarian differences between the Saudi Salafi version of Sunni Islam versus the Iranian Shiite version that emphasized the Islamic republicanism. The Islamic radicals were kept busy as they were fighting the Soviet forces in Afghanistan, but very early it was proven that radicalism could be crucial and dangerous, as an Islamist assassinated the Egyptian president Anwar al-Sadat in 1981. The assassination of the first Arab leader who established an embassy in Israel and was working hard to establish everlasting peace was a heavy blow to Israel's hope for a regional peace. The radicals intensified the Arabian official attitude that was already negative toward any deals with Israel, but this would not be clearly seen until the 2000s. Israel, like any other democratic society, sees itself as a singular player in an ocean of dictatorships, and some Israeli politicians believed that creating a democratic Palestinian state or a Palestinian autonomous region would form, hypothetically, a state of stability between the two counterparts. As a result of Oslo, beginning in 1993, the Palestinian Authority was established, and it was probably still an optimistic vision that pushing Palestinians into actual political action would generate a situation where elected officials would seek a peace deal with Israel. However, the Palestinian Authority failed to achieve transparent government, and instead corruption was widespread and freedom of speech usually suppressed. Lurie A. Allen believes that the Second Intifada was, quotation, an uprising about a stateless people against multiple power regimes, against the Israeli occupation, of course, but also against the Palestinian Authority, end of quotation. However, it is easy to fantasize such a situation and to put the blame on Israel, for it is the most powerful state in the Middle East. But we should notice that the Palestinian position is problematic because Israel is indeed perplexed about how to solve the circle of struggle of the Palestinian two poles of power, the secular nationalists of PLO versus the Islamists who have a fantasy about a universal war against the Jews. One could argue that the failed Palestinian Authority was to be blamed on Israel because the latter wanted from this authority to have the rule of a puppet state. And probably it is easy in such a situation to convince the Palestinian people that the PA is a part of an Israeli plan to cause a Palestinian civil war. Nevertheless, the real issue is whether the U.S. and Israel have the right to intervene in shaping a specific model that we can call democratic for the Palestinian people. In reality, the PA formed a government that lacked a practical democracy because of corruption, bribery, and no balance between the president and the PLC. Such situation drove some voices to call for countering corruption with an obvious linking between terrorism and corruption as a correlated problem. It is conceivable that the determinations of Israeli Prime Minister Barak and President Clinton to settle an ultimate agreement at the time for the duration of the Camp David summit of summer 2000 and the confrontational visit to the Temple Mount by the leader of the Israeli opposition at the time, Ariel Sharon, shortly thereafter, were understood as an intimidation by those same challenging powers within the Palestinian national movement. In such a situation, the aspect of peacemaking with Israel was lost in the PA, and with such a development, Israel too was not interested in risking its interests to an adversary who is not concerned in peace and mutual respect. Israel's geopolitical position as a tiny small country compared to an ocean of giant Arab states, not to add the vast Islamic world, made Israel hesitant to offer more concessions to the Palestinians without getting offers that guarantee Israel's confidence in any permanent deals. In 2006, Hamas won in the Palestinian election that damaged the PA, and the result of disagreements over this election's outcomes led the two sides to confrontation that ended in Hamas's control through a relatively brutal overthrowing of the PA in Gaza. The rise of the Islamic ideology on the Palestinian scene was an announcement of a tremendous transformation in the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, because Hamas and other Islamic political movements shifted the struggle and the encounter with Israel from being purely political as a confrontation with Israel as a state and as an institution to a religious zeal of hate and war toward every Jewish community or even individuals all over the world. Actually, Bassam Tibi composed an entire book to argue that the majority of Islamic political movements has an agenda of becoming superpowers involved in an actual excommunicating any form of opposition or diversity. And instead of adopting true democratic form of governing, Tibi makes a distinction between Islam as a religion that has all the attributes of other religions and the religionized political movements that proclaim themselves as the embodiment of Islam. An example of the maneuvering political theorization of the Islamists would be the fact that the Islamists such as Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin fi Misr, would adopt in the media at least the democratic concepts of campaigning and electing officials to win the popular vote, and by this mean entering government. However, this acceptance is not genuine for the simple reason that they hold the belief of having the blessing of the true faith, a monopoly on the spiritual, and thereafter the worldly legitimacy. Dr. Ishtiaq Hussain and Professor Bilal Al-Shobaki published a scientific research titled Hamas in Power, a research on ideology and politics, 2006 to 2012, discussing a Hamas role in politics after its control over Gaza and what consequences could turn out from such an experience. Both argue that the Western research institutions and think tanks had become victims of the ta'tim and obscuring and the tafsit, simplifying the terms of the issues when it comes to analyzing Hamas as a movement of resistance. The paper then goes to argue that Hamas has its own belief in democratic processes, which is common in the majority of Islamic movements, to seek an implementation of Sharia Islamic rule. Such ideology could be called democratic, just as an absolutist regime, such as North Korea, calls itself democratic, without having anything to do with democracy and free elections. In this scene, one could apply the Egyptian proverb that says, request a rabbit, get a rabbit. Request a gazelle, get a rabbit. In all cases, the outcome would be the same, no matter what you call it. The reason the Palestinian community could not move forward towards a more democratic environment is due to the political excuses that both Hamas, Al-Jihad, and other Palestinian factions use to keep themselves armed to the teeth is the resistance of the Israeli occupation. Such claim has two consequences. First, it keeps the actual government that represents the Palestinian people weak and powerless. Therefore, it has no power whatsoever to implement any deal with the Israeli government. Second, any resistance from the PA to such belligerent arms would be used by Hamas and its allies as a cooperation with Al-Adu al-Sahiyuni or Al-Adu al-Israeli, the Israeli foe, as they call it. Therefore, when the second Intifada was launched, it was not a peaceful social unrest, but it was a confrontational battle where the Palestinians used suicide attacks and armed outbreaks to hurt the Israelis, believing that the Jewish population would soon flee to Europe and other parts of the world. In conclusion, Israel believed through the negotiations of Oslo that creating a Palestinian entity that is similar to Israel's democratic infrastructure would open the door for the transformation of the Palestinian hostile community to a peaceful municipality. What went wrong with the Palestinian partner in this case was that Arafat's team brought all the corruption habits they have learned during the diaspora into their homeland, and therefore creating an experiment of dictatorship and exploitation that led the Palestinian people to join the radical opposition, Hamas, Al-Jihad, and others, forcing the Palestinian negotiators to have negative positions that contributed to the failure of the peace talks. On the Israeli side, the government fears that the PA had joined the radicals and any peace talks are meaningless because the Palestinians, in fact, have returned to the pre-Oslo situation where the Palestinian organizations were conducting terrorist attacks against Israel. In such a condition, it seems that we are far from reaching the solution of the two states or even three states. Two Palestinian states along with Israel. On the ground, Palestinians have two governments, but we should say that we are far from seeing Israel officially accepting such a condition. And finally, I think that Donald Trump's administration is just simplifying everything to a simple solution that I don't think is going to work. See you in the next episode.